1970s, a decade full of Cold War, innovation, inflation, and much more. Throughout this talk, we will be discussing many aspects of the 70s and how they match up to where we are now. First things first, what the decade looked like in terms of the economy, politics, and other major parts of the decade. The 70s were an action-packed decade with no break in the flow of events throughout 10 years. One of the biggest parts of the 70s was the ending of the Vietnam War by the Nixon administration in 1973. After the war continued to draw mass protests from the American people and struggling war efforts.
During the Nixon presidency, the 1972 Watergate scandal gripped the nation's media for months as the plan and all players involved in the breach at the Democratic headquarters came into the public light. This scandal was the reason for Nixon's resignation in 1974 after he was implicated in the scandal. The major Cold War events of the 70s came with the signing of the SALT I Treaty, which limited the amount of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, either nation could have. The low tension from this treaty was short-lived after the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. On the pop culture side of things, the music world was hit with two major blows after the death of Elvis in 1977 and the separation of the Beatles in 1974. These two events left the music stage in the U.S. void of two major stars.
Some of the other major events of the 1970s included the post-civil rights movement, which contained push for LGBTQ rights as well as abortion rights. America also faced fuel shortages and moving of the Midwest factories and oil embargoes and the Ted Bundy killing spree. While there's no doubt the 70s were a decade full of action, what did our economy look like? What jobs were the most popular? And what did our government's fiscal policy look like? All of that and more after a brief message from our sponsor.
Look, man, I'm so bored. I wish I had something to do, something to play with. I wish I had my own pet. Hey, what's he doing over there? Looks like he's having fun. Let's go check out what he's doing. Hey, what are you doing?
I'm just playing with my pet rock.
A pet rock? What's that?
It's my pet rock, Wilson.
Oh, that's pretty cool, man. I'm gonna ask my mom if I can get one later today.
Well, do you want to come play with me and Wilson?
Sure do.
Yeah, come on, let's go.
Let's go. Come on, Wilson.
Wow, it looks like you're having so much more fun now.
All thanks to Pet Rock. If you want your own pet rock, call 1-800-PET-ROCK to get your own today.
Please note that Pet Rock is not viable for any injuries that occur while playing with Pet Rock. Please purchase at your own risk. Batteries are not included. Please call 1-800-PET-ROCK with any questions for more information.
Policymakers in the Fed were left with their hands tied in terms of how to tackle inflation because of rising food and oil prices. There was no answer on how to solve the problem without crippling the economy and sending unemployment up. President Jimmy Carter tried to tackle the crisis, but his lack of regard for deficit caused more problems than it solved. Stagflation was occurring, and eventually the interest rate was raised to 21% by the Fed.
With unemployment and inflation climbing too fast, a stop-and-go monetary policy was implemented to try and combat both. During a go phase, the Fed would loosen up money in the economy by lowering interest in hopes to fighting unemployment. In a stop phase, though, the Fed would raise the interest rates to tighten the economy up in order to fight inflation. The stop-and-go plan eventually failed, with inflation and unemployment back on the rise at the tail end of the decade, with the low economic growth causing more unemployment and the easy money policy creating nothing but higher inflation. Moving away from what the government side of the economy looked like, working in the 70s was centered around manufacturing, mining, construction, mechanical work, and maintenance work, with some evolving jobs in the tech world. The highest earning jobs of the 70s would still be the CEOs, and the lowest would be the part-time minimum wage workers.
From a lifestyle perspective, the 1970s were a far different time than we know today. Basic goods were drastically cheaper than they are today. Milk was only $1.32 a gallon. chicken was $1 per pound, and ground beef was 59 cents per pound. Eggs were 60 cents for a dozen, and a box of cereal was just $4.40 per box. Other living expenses were completely different as well, with rent on a house would be only around $108. A gallon of gas would be 36 or 70 cents instead of the $4 that we know today. And a brand new Ford truck would only be $3,300 instead of the $30,000 that it is today.
Even a cup of coffee was 65 cents rather than the $5 spent at Starbucks today. A loaf of bread was also 70 cents. Now those items may all seem very cheap with the way wages are today, but in the 70s, the average middle-class family brought in just $13,000 every year, showing just how much inflation has shaped our lifetimes compared to the people in the 70s. With such low incomes compared to today, it only makes sense that the average home price was also low compared to today, with the median house price being $23,000 at the start of the decade and about $55,000 at the end. With all that inflation in mind, what did the 70s bring to the table? What was new or different in the 70s? Things like the email were in the very earliest stages. VCRs were invented, and even video games saw their earliest evolutions, with arcades being sprouted up everywhere.
Following the trend of new things in the 70s, some of the most common clothing styles that were popularized during the 70s included bell-bottoms, frayed jeans, maxi skirts, and flared collared shirts. Music was also having new styles emerge through the 70s with things like funk, soul, R&B, pop, hard rock, soft rock, and disco. The 70s were also home to some interesting fads. Things like roller skating became very huge during the 70s, as well as punk rock, having wood paneling everywhere, and having cheesy jingles for advertisements. Now it's time to look at some of the numbers of the 70s.
During the 70s, minimum wage increased from $1.60 to $3.10. Unemployment during the 70s was anywhere between 5.4 and 7.9%, with rates on the rise at the end of the decade and interest rates over 7% and reaching 10% by the end of the decade. Despite inflation crisis of the 70s decade, the average rate was only 6.5%, but CPI shows the direness of the economy starting the decade at 38.8% and ending at 72.6%, an 87% increase overall. With all that in mind, there's no doubt that the 70s were an interesting and eventful decade with some glaring similarities to what life is like right now in the economy.
Thank you guys for watching.